It's the Metro on WDET. I'm Robyn, Vincent. President Trump and Republicans want to change our elections in big ways. Recently, the president signed an executive order that seeks to change how mail-in voting works, having it overseen by the Department of Homeland Security. Trump and Republicans are also trying to pass the SAVE Act. It would ensure voters provide documentary proof of citizenship at the time of registration and a photo ID at the time of voting. Now, all of this is happening as the president has called to nationalize the elections. And as MAGA influencer Steve Bannon has asked ICE officials to patrol polling locations in November. What should we make of all these changes? How secure are our voting systems? And is the president trying to make voting less secure for his advantage? Justin Roebuck is the chief election official for Ottawa County in West Michigan. He joins me now. Justin, welcome to the Metro.
Hey, thanks for having me, Robyn.
And the phone lines are open, 313-577-1019. We want to know how you're feeling about voting this year. Are you concerned about election security? So, Justin, you've said in interviews that we're in a, quote, difficult moment in our country right now. You work as a clerk. What are the things that you're seeing? I mean, what are people struggling with in Ottawa County?
I think that's a great question. Yeah, and, we are in a difficult moment in terms of our politics, right? We have seen the administration of elections come under significantly more scrutiny than we have, at least in my career or lifetime, really since 2020 and a little bit before that. There are a lot of challenges that we face, both in election administration when it comes to public confidence, but also challenges that our voters face when it comes to what they can trust and what they, what information coming to them is true and what is perhaps a narrative that is advancing a political ball down a court, so to speak. So I think, that is what makes it such a difficult moment. But I also have a lot of faith in the system that we have. We have so many checks and balances in place to make our election process run well. And I'm very confident coming into the 2026 elections in the state of Michigan and really across the country, but particularly here in Michigan where I'm at, I'm very confident that we will have a successful election.
Okay, so we have a collision of sorts happening, though. I mean, you have astutely pointed out there are a lot of checks and balances, but at the same time, voters have less trust in our voting system. I mean, before President Trump was reelected, confidence in our voting system was at nearly 77%. Now it's at 60%. So I'm wondering, for you as an election official, what do you think is the cause of that specifically?
I think when it comes to confidence and public trust, all of our institutions over the past, number of years, public institutions have felt this pressure, right? This decline in public confidence. And I think there's a lot of factors at play. But when it comes particularly to the elections process, I really, really believe that, you and I, people, we are built to trust information that comes from sources that we trust. I think that's how our brains are wired a lot of times to help us navigate the world. We sort of innately have this mindset of trusting information that comes from sources that we believe and that we trust. And so I think when you're in an environment where either, political parties or candidates or perhaps media sources or other individuals who seek to gain in any sort of way from sharing information, when they're motivated to share information that causes fear and mistrust, that becomes really a challenge for us in election administration when that information may or may not be true, or perhaps is built on one tiny bit of truthful information, but then is extrapolated essentially to, an intentionally caused fear. And so that's a struggle. That's a struggle every day. And I think that is what is in some cases driving this sort of, overall mistrust in the system that we have.
Well, I want to talk a little bit more about who the arbiters are here of this mistrust. I want to play a recent clip of President Trump talking about how our voting system should change. And this is him on the Dan Bongino show.
The Republicans should say, we want to take over. We should take over the voting in at least 15 places. The Republicans ought to nationalize the voting.
It is no secret that one of the people who has been sowing the mistrust is President Trump. Do you think President Trump's actions have had any influence over increased skepticism in our election system?
Yeah, of course. I think that is certainly the case. And I think, in this moment, a lot of the skepticism belongs to the responsibility of this belongs to the Republican Party.
You are a Republican, I want to be clear.
I am an elected Republican. And I think that is not always the case. Both parties have at different times in our history and even in more recent history, this has also belonged to the Democratic Party. But ultimately, in my role as an election administrator, I'm not trying to speak from a partisan level. I'm trying to speak from, a level of fact and based essentially in the data, which is what we do every day as election administrators. I think it's an interesting challenge that we have really across the country that our election administrators, by and large, are elected partisan officials, which is fascinating. And, I think probably a topic of conversation for another time where maybe we can, look at some institutional tweaks in how we run things and make things go, more neutrally in some cases. But ultimately, I think, when I hear these types of discussions, I go back to my fundamental beliefs in the U.S. Constitution and what I took an oath to uphold. Not as a Republican, not as a Democrat, but as an American citizen who takes an oath of office that I take really seriously when I administer elections. And our U.S. Constitution is really clear about who runs elections. It is the states, and to a certain extent, it's Congress.
Clerk Roebuck, if I may jump in, what I'm hearing from you, though, is that President Trump's rhetoric and the rhetoric and actions of the Republicans have been making your job harder. Is that right?
Politics always makes elections challenging. So, every single election, it's an interesting field, right? Because we are dealing with something that is innately political and yet administrative at its core. Mm-hmm. So in our day-to-day job as election administrators, what we do is very non-political, and yet politics influences it every day. And so certainly political rhetoric on both sides will influence the process, or at least, people are always attempting to influence the process. But yeah, I would not shy away from saying that, this current administration and the Republican Party have made trust a particularly challenging environment to operate in.
I mean, you keep saying, though, that it's happening on both sides, but I think we should be clear about the fact that Democrats have long tried to expand access to voting, and Republicans continue to try and shrink that access. I can't think of a lot of instances where Democrats have been trying to sow distrust into the system or do some of the things that we're seeing now by limiting access to voting. I mean, can you give some examples?
Yeah, and I don't think I'm here to talk politics. I think I'm here to talk process.
Yeah.
So I don't really want to get into the weeds of political examples. One example that I will share is the 2018 campaign in Georgia from Stacey Abrams, for example, where she has yet to concede her loss in the Georgia election in 2018. And there really was a pretty big movement there fostered by Ms. Abrams and her campaign to sow distrust in the process of Georgia elections, which which ironically, the foundations of that led to some of the further distrust sown in 2020 after President Trump lost Georgia. And so
But it
I think
also
the
brought out a
reality that we're
lot of
in,
people to vote. No, a lot of people that had not voted before came out because of Stacey Abrams' work.
well, and I think that's the beauty of the system. What we're seeing is not declining numbers, and that is a success. I think we have a lot of challenges in election administration as a whole. But one of the things that I count as a success are really two factors. One, we have more people who want to be involved in the process of election administration. So saying, how can I help? How can I serve as an election worker? What are ways that I can get a little bit more involved? And then the other way, ultimately participation. We love participation. And I think the challenges of our political climate have encouraged participation overall, and that is something that we can point to as a success.
Well, let's get more into that, into this beautiful idea of voter participation. President Trump recently signed an executive order instructing the Department of Homeland Security to create lists of eligible voters in every state. The U.S. Postal Service would then use that information to identify voters who can receive mail ballots with special barcodes for tracking. That order is now being challenged in court. I'm wondering, as an election official, what do you make of Trump's order?
Yeah, I think this is, certainly a lot of the discussion nationally around this framework of ultimately, encouraging and bolstering the process when it comes to only citizens participating in our elections, right? Which is a conversation that's worth having. But I really don't believe the reality here is that I think there's so many significant legal, practical hurdles in this particular executive order, and I think it is going to make it exceptionally difficult to implement. I don't think this executive order is something that our voters are going to have to be concerned about in this election cycle. I can put it that way.
There are people who believe that this is part of a broader move by the Trump administration to rig the election in his favor or in favor of Republicans. Do you think that's true?
Well, I can't speak to intent, but what I think I can speak to is, the reality on the ground is that implementing something of this magnitude will truly take longer than an election cycle. If we were to bar all of the legal challenges that it's going through right now, taking that off the table, essentially what the order has asked for or has directed the Department of Homeland Security interface with 50 states and essentially 10,000 election jurisdictions to compare citizenship data and voter records. And again, there are literal legal hurdles in that process alone. But barring the legal hurdles, the 60-day time frame that was given for that to be implemented, I just don't think is a practical reality that we're going to be facing in this election cycle. So
in other words, it's a logistical mess. It's asking local clerks to really jump through many, many hoops.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, we have to be really, really cautious when it comes to this data as well. And I think, I think it's fair to say that citizenship verification is something that people expect from their election system, right? That is the rule in democracies all around the world. It is certainly the rule of law here in the United States. You have to be a citizen in order to vote. And I want to be clear as well that the system we have right now, today, that is implemented right now and that will be implemented for our election cycle in 2026 is secure. And it takes multiple layers of verification. But I think that citizenship question is a fair question. But I also think we really have to thoughtfully approach it from the federal and state level to ensure that we have 100% accuracy in the data and to make sure that we're not putting this burden on voters to prove citizenship. I use an example. My 80-year-old grandma who's been voting for, 60 years. but needs to track down her birth certificate. Like that is an impracticality.
That's
and that's
absurd.
not absolutely. And that's not the role of the federal government has a job here, and the states have a job here, and they can do that job in verification. But we have to be very, very careful about how we approach that.
It's the Metro on WDET. I'm Robyn Vincent. My guest is Justin Roebuck. He's the Ottawa County Clerk. We're discussing election security and what he makes of recent efforts of Republicans and the Trump administration to change the way voting happens in this country, especially because, again, you are a clerk with an R next to your name. I mean, citizenship is already a requirement to vote. And instances of non-citizens voting are incredibly rare. I mean, let's be real about this. And you support the SAVE Act, and that is the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act. It would require voters to provide documentary proof of citizenship at the time of registration and a photo ID at the time of voting. So why do you think we need that?
So I want to be clear, I don't support or oppose the legislation that's pending right now. I've never come out in favor of or against the SAVE Act or other federal legislation. We're standing by at the administrative level to implement whatever comes our way from the state or from the federal government. But here's why I think, the SAVE Act in particular, it is an example of why we have to be very, very careful with citizenship. Now, I want to be clear, I support citizens-only voting in our elections. That is something that I share in common with a vast majority of Americans, and I think that is something that we would expect from our election system. And as you pointed out, Robyn, these instances of non-citizens voting are so rare. When you think about from the perspective of a non-citizen, I think they're rare because the cost versus risk, the risk to benefit ratio is really not there. A non-citizen risks everything
Clerk
by
Roebuck,
participating in an American election.
Forgive me for jumping in, but I mean, yes, does it concern you that instead of preventing non-citizens from voting, we're actually going to end up preventing legitimate voters from casting a ballot because of this legislation?
Well, I think that is why we have to approach any legislation that would change this process very, very carefully. And that is basically, my stance on this from the perspective of an election administrator. Again, I think it's the federal government's job to interface with the states and get that data right. It's not the voters' job to try to go and prove who they are. But ultimately, I want to be clear, too, that like in Michigan, we have so many checks and balances in place already, and really in states throughout the country, because of the Real ID Act, for example. We already have the vast majority of our voters on our voter rolls because of interfacing with the Secretary of State's office. And the Secretary of State, of course, is our chief election officer as well as our DMV. And the Real ID Act requires that citizens produce documentary proof of citizenship in order to obtain a real ID. So the reality on the ground is a lot of this ground has already been covered. And I think with an appropriate investment, a serious investment from our federal and state government and from our federal and state legislatures, we could accomplish citizenship verification without putting that burden on the citizen.
I mean, one more point on the SAVE Act, Clerk Roebuck. You did say on Point that, quote, so to the extent that the SAVE Act can bolster the security of that process, I support that. So are you saying to me now, though, that you have concerns about it?
I think that my only concern with the SAVE Act or with other potential changes, such as legislation in Michigan locally or, for example, a statewide constitutional amendment that would do largely the same thing. My only concern with this is that to the extent they put the burden of proof upon our currently registered voters to essentially come up with documentation to prove what they have already attested to.
Before I let you go, because
we need to look at those things.
We're running out of time here, but I want to acknowledge that your job is really tough. I realize a lot of clerks have complained of harassment, particularly around the time of the pandemic. So I would be remiss to, before I let you go, not ask, what has the experience been like for you over the past few years?
Yeah, I think there's no doubt that it's been a huge challenge in a lot of ways, right? And I look back at, really the time from the pandemic on and say, like, we've gone through a lot. And so have a lot of Americans, I'm not alone in that. We've certainly experienced a lot of things together, but it is a privilege to do this work, and it's a joy. We can't forget that the process of voting is ultimately such an amazing right. And it's a privilege to be able to help people in my community along in that process.
Justin Roebuck is the chief election official for Ottawa County. Thank you for joining me on the Metro. Thanks for the work that you do.
Thanks so much, Robyn. Appreciate it.
It's the Metro on WDET. I'm Robyn Vincent. Coming up, Michigan's teachers are leaving the profession. We'll speak with someone who's trying to keep them in the classroom. That's next. Stay with us.